Let me introduce Professor Josephine Forbes, who is a group leader based at the Matter Research and the Fraser Institute at the University of Queensland. And her work largely focuses on translational studies, both in novel therapies to prevent type 1 diabetes, but also on its complications. And Josie is also president-elect of the Australian Diabetes Society. She is previous chair of Diabetes Australia Research Program and also recipient of many very prestigious awards. And we're lucky to have her moderating the discussion in this session. Thank you. It's on.
I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction there, Dorota. Okay, so I think you can all agree that that was a very exhausting session. Data everywhere. What to do, obtained over long time periods. Safety versus efficacy. Regulatory concerns. Jargons, all of us talking different languages. So, where to go? My panel, I'm very fortunate, are going to answer these questions for you in the next hour. I'd like each of you to introduce yourself and to bring to everyone in the room what your perspective on each of these would be in terms of from your position. So what is your current position and what would you be doing in terms of this? Are you industry? Are you a funder? What's your role? Sanjoy?
Hello everyone, Sanjoy Dutta with JDRF International based out of New York and the research department there. And primary role is as a funder, but also as an advocate for policy with regulators and insurers, which is very different in each country there. So I play that role overseeing research. We'll work in close concert with my policy colleagues in Washington, D.C. for health and regulatory matters there.
Hello, I'm Simon Barry. I am a molecular biologist. I am deeply embedded in the interface between basic science and clinical. I'm, amongst other things, part of the India Consortium. I've worked in industry and biotech as well as in academia, and I think that kind of sums what I'm trying to do, which is close the gap, come up with new things and try them soon.
Fabienne Mackay. I am the Director and CEO of the Queensland Institute of Medical Research Berghofer, but on my spare time I'm an immunologist and an autoimmunologist with an interest in autoimmune disease. And I come very much from the basic science side, and I always consider an autoimmune disease like a crime scene. And I like to go back to that crime scene, look at the evidence and find the culprit to find a cure.
I'm Tom Kay. I'm from St Vincent. I'm the director of St Vincent's Institute in Melbourne. I've been working in the field for a long time. I strongly believe that the more we understand about mechanisms of disease, the more likely we are to get successful therapies, and that's really, I hope you heard that through Helen and my talk this afternoon. And I see my role now very much around this after this really 50 years of trying to better, not for me, but for the field of trying to better understand diabetes mechanisms, how can we now have an impact on clinical practice? And I see the field as being at some sort of on the cusp, an inflection point where that's highly possible, but still needs a lot of work.
Ranjeny?
Ranjeny Thomas. Am I on? I completely concur with Tom in that last statement. I'm a clinician scientist in rheumatology, and I've just worked as well in type 1 diabetes. That has been really very enlightening for me to work across two different diseases, to see the similarities and differences both in the basic science and also the clinical approaches and the way that the approaches have been in developing new drugs. I have spun out two companies now and in the quest to commercialise antigen-specific immunotherapy, and worked with several major pharma partners. And the big difference between rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes is the availability of partners. So yeah, I'd love to see more collaboration.
Colin?
So I've been introduced before, but I should just say I think the two areas maybe that came out of my talk that I'm most passionate about. One is advocating the unmet need, and that's to to industrial partners, but also to our colleagues in diabetes and endocrinology, that we need to move in this direction. And the other side is to advance clinical trial networks and clinical trial design so we can do this much, much quicker.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Katja. I'm the head of health tech at Cicada Innovations, which is a deep tech incubator that has been for 23 years based out of Sydney, helped science based or research based innovations to reach market. So we are a support for commercialization. And I guess the perspective I bring here today is really that amazing work that is being done on the research side of how that could faster make an impact through commercialization and translation.
Thank you. Christine Garberg. I'm a mum of a son with type 1 and I'm representing the community today.
Hi everyone, I'm Lenny Ramos. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Prevention Bio. Admittedly, I'm not an endocrinologist, I'm a transplant nephrologist. And I've been involved in a lot of drug development, but I have to say that this has been the most rewarding because I think we, at least with the teplizumab, has paved the way to open the door for other immune therapies. And not just helping to do more trials with the teplizumab, but to help other companies, other organizations to understand the endpoints that we're going to use for future trials, not just for stage 2, possibly for stage 3. So I'm very glad to be a part of it.
I'm Kim Donaghue. I'm a paediatric endocrinologist, and I've been working in the field I've been a consultant at the Children's Hospital at Westmead and University of Sydney since 1990, having done my training in Children's Hospital and in adult hospitals. So I come from the perspective, I'm a clinical researcher. I come more from the stage 4, stage 5, but see many children and families distressed and continually distressed with the anxieties, even with the technology we currently have. So I've been very excited by what I've heard today, and particularly like the concept of moving from type 1 to type 0.
So as you can see, some very esteemed colleagues up here. And so I'm going to start with Christine. Can you tell me what your greatest hope is? Listening to some of the things that was said today and some of the people who are here, what are you going to tell them?
Thank you, firstly, for giving us hope. I think that's the one thing that we all live for and live with. When my son was diagnosed at 3 years of age, we were told by 18 there'll be a cure. In a way, there is. He's on a closed loop system, and it's the closest thing that we've ever had to great control. And he's a 19-year-old, so he's one of those ones where the HbA1c is out of control. But the pump is really giving us the closest thing. So hope, I think, is the one thing that what I've heard from today, I have for other families who have not yet embarked on the type 1 journey and may never have to. And if we can prolong the onset of type 1, I think that's going to make a huge difference, not just to the individuals, obviously, but the families, the pressure, to your point, the stresses and the burdens that come with it. And to be able to avoid some of the challenges that young children face as they become teenagers, if they're diagnosed as young children, the burnout, the mental illness, suicidality, all of those things that we face and they face, that if we can avoid that, I think there's great hope for the community and for the siblings and families of those who do have type 1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I wanted to go on to now, though, are some of the challenges that we're going to face in, facing some of these issues. So I wanted to start from an endocrinology perspective. We've got both paediatric and adult endocrinologists, and as we've heard, type 1 diabetes is not just a disease of children, it is a disease of young adults and elderly people, actually. And so what would you like to say is the greatest challenge of bringing a new disease-modifying therapy into your clinic? So if one was made available tomorrow, it was approved in Australia, what is your biggest challenge? Tom, would you like to start?
Well, I'm a bit of a retired adult endocrinologist. And I'm going to lay claim to being also being having a ticket in immunology. But I think the biggest challenge for me, as has been mentioned, I've been involved in the islet transplant business for quite a long time with my colleagues Phil O'Connell and Toby Coates, and over the journey with that, there's no doubt there's a big challenge to convince. Changing the main therapy for a disease is a huge job, or introducing a new therapy is a huge job. And I think for me, it was tough through the islet transplant, whole introduction of islet transplantation, to encourage our colleagues to send referrals and so on. So I think that is a big challenge, convincing the mainstream endocrinology community that this is really happening, and we're really going to be doing this. I don't think we should underestimate that. Of course, results will have an impact if people see good outcomes. People will be convinced by that. It's not as if you can passively produce evidence and assume that it will naturally move into practice. I think it has to be a much more active process than that of getting evidence into practice.
Thank you. And Colin, is that your experience from overseas? Is our experience the same as Cardiff?
Yeah, it's exactly the same, except it's a conceptual leap that endocrinologists don't know what a T cell is, they don't know what a B cell is, and once you go beyond that, they just zone out. And they're very afraid, and they think that insulin is a safe drug, and they think that the other drugs are unsafe drugs. They think that immune therapy is cyclosporine. All of these cultural changes need to happen. I think teplizumab woke them up because they thought, oh God, I don't know what that drug is, and it's got the word diabetes next to it. I think that whole cultural change of changing what we do and becoming, Fergus is just saying, I'm going to open a stage 2 clinic. Open your stage 2 clinics, think of yourself as that is your area. So I think, and just one other point to say about that is that, when Joe Hedrick was at Janssen, I certainly got the impression that they'd gone around and talked to endocrinologists, and they'd said, we don't need that drug. We don't need drugs in this space. We have closed loop pumps, we're done. And that's what drove that company to walk away from this whole field, and many other companies, because of our colleagues saying, we don't need this.
And Kim, perhaps some even greater challenges in the paediatric endocrinology space. Would you like to tell us about your perception of a new drug coming in?
Well, I guess it depends where it's coming in the disease process. If it's a stage 2 clinic, I really enjoyed your discussion previously about the difficulty screening. I was an investigator in the INIT study, and I was involved in TrialNet, and it was quite difficult to get the families to have their children screened. They were happy for blind screening, but they didn't want to know the results. They really didn't want to think about the fact that they've got one child, how can I deal with another one? I don't really want to know that. And I'm not just talking about the patients, it was also the health professionals themselves. They thought that that their children would be at risk, and they didn't want to enrol their children. Having said that, I was very pleased to hear the lovely sisters this morning. They are actually patients from the clinic. So they are good. But I guess in terms of if it's a treatment at stage 3, I think it's going to be a long discussion to look at the side effects, but I think the families are going to be very keen, especially if there's a time period where they're facing the difficulties of going home, managing the diabetes, maybe for a couple of weeks. They often come back with completely different sets of coping, resilience issues that it's hard to tell when you first meet a family how they'll cope, and they don't know till they get home.
And so, Ranjeny, are we just being oversensitive? Obviously, some very specific immunotherapies have been rolled out for rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune conditions. Would you like to tell us about your experience?
Well, yes, I think you are being a bit oversensitive, and I think that it doesn't take much. It takes, conference presentations, marketing, speaking to clinicians individually, seminars. It just takes the usual medical education process, and it can be done. So I don't think I would see it as a major reason not to develop a drug. It just is something that will happen, and Lenny, you must have thought about this as well. It's very important that the companies help to drive this, because they've got to sell their drug and they help to market to the prescribers. So I think it's a all of community effort. So I'm not concerned that you won't get over this. I was thinking about what the learnings are between the condition that I treat as a clinician and type 1 diabetes, and I think, like Colin, disease-modifying therapies and disease-modifying drugs are not actually curative drugs. We don't even consider them curative in rheumatoid arthritis. So I don't understand why there's been so many trials in type 1 diabetes of short-term treatment with drugs that were never developed to cure autoimmune disease. They're anti-inflammatory in some way, shape or form. And I think, coming back to lifestyle, the same lifestyle, so the Mediterranean diet and exercise factors that have been shown to mitigate the risk of rheumatoid arthritis have also subsequently been shown to reduce the severity of the outcome of new onset rheumatoid arthritis and to enhance the possibility of remission. So we don't shy away from this. We say, look, part of it is our job to give you drugs. Part of it is your job to get the best possible outcome you can. And it's as simple as that. And I think the other thing about treat to target in rheumatology, rheumatoid arthritis, is we treat to remission. That's the point we're treating to. And I think the aim is, and patients love this, we're going to get you into remission as soon as we can with as much drug as we need. And then we're going to try to keep you there. And it's powerful because that then becomes a partnership to keep the patient in the best possible control. So I think it's partly in the language that you adopt to get the patient and the family on board with what you as a clinician know, because there's an evidence base, is the best thing for them. So that's my perspective.
Just want to add to that, it's also the openness to the endocrinologist to accept that young man who came to you and said, I'm not taking insulin, I'm going to take Harmon. I'm not suggesting that all of your patients will come to you as an endocrinologist and say, I want to take this. But the fact that people are so much more aware, they can do their own research, they can access research papers, they are coming better educated than we were. And I was looking at the dates of these research. Even 10 years ago, that didn't exist. That information didn't exist for me to make a choice for my child. But now all this amazing information exists. So I think, yes, we need to shift the endocrinologist's perspective and maybe move it away from me as the expert, you as the patient, to us as a team collaborating together along what you were saying. To actually get the best outcome for this individual, because we know that type 1 impacts every single person differently. And so you cannot treat everyone in the same way, and therefore there needs to be some respect at the endocrinologist level to acknowledge the choices that the individual may want to make. And I'm not saying refusing treatment, but it's giving them the option.
So Christine, can I ask you a little bit more what that looks like? Because I did talk about language barriers, because often when I'm talking to different people, I literally pull out a different set of words. And so what I wanted to understand from you, and for you to put out to the panel today, is if you wanted to access that information in a way that you knew that the information was correct, because that's obviously an incredibly difficult task on the internet, what would that look like?
I actually would rely and want my endocrinologist to say to me and give me a presentation like the ones we heard this morning, which were so accessible in terms of the information they were presenting and a layperson to be able to understand, so that I'm informed enough, knowing that it's backed by data, knowing that it's backed by the research, and then be able to say, well, here are the different options, here are the risks, here are the benefits. How do you want it? I still rely on my endo because they're the expert.
Thank you. So Lenny, can I come back to you? So you've had experience over a really long period of time, starting with anti-CD3, teplizumab, Tzield, whatever you would like to call it, right at the very beginning, all the way to now where it's a very exciting prospect and is showing us the pathway to actually get these therapies into the clinic. What would you say is the major thing that needs to happen for us to make that process more rapid?
Education. Education across the board. What I feel sometimes is that we are all the sponsors, the regulators, patients, the advocacy group are all in a different plane. You see, I mean, this is a very unique group right here because to some extent, you came together for a reason. But I totally agree with you. I think we need better education of our endocrinologists. Some don't know that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. Why would you even consider an immunomodulator? The other thing that I've heard through my journey here, which has been very long, is they're afraid. They're afraid of this drug because it touches the immune system. And maybe to some extent, we were speaking last night with Tom, maybe we have to change the name of this drug to a disease-modifying drug. Not to say that we're hiding what it does, but it's the words that you use that affects how the other party is going to accept it. But let me just go back from my perspective doing drug development. Even the regulators have a totally different understanding, and lightning bolt strike me. There's a disconnect between what the family or the patient needs and what they're trying to develop. So there's now understanding that regulators have a very high bar. Of course, they have to do that, but that needs to change because the bar that they set may be, and I'm not speaking for our company, but for other companies, the bars are so unattainable, and because the field is changing. The field is changing with all this technology and all the endpoints that they want may not be relevant. So, I think from that perspective, it's important to see a shift in their thinking. And then for drug companies, sponsors, to be brave. You cannot just say, I'm going to go for the indication that's going to get me everybody. I think to be honest, you have to have companies, and I would have to say when we at Prevention, we started, we had a lot of resistance and obstacles to convince even our board to go and pursue this drug. And when it's already 20 years into the development, and where is it? So I think we need to continue that strength. We need people like JDRF because we started out with the T1D fund. So it's really a village, and we need continued collaboration.
So Katja, from your perspective, from industry, do you hold that same opinion, or do you think there are other challenges that we haven't thought about?
I'm not from industry, so we kind of deconduit between industry and funders and research. So in that regard, what we commonly see is actually leaning up very early on. When we work with researchers, the first thing we do is we actually drill a little bit deeper into, do they really understand the unmet need? Not only from a clinical point of view, but from the point of view of a variety of stakeholders who all have to be aligned for something to succeed. And that includes patients and their families, it includes the clinicians, it includes ultimately the buyers, which could be, Medicare or a private buyer, but it also is industry, because industry is the most common access to market. So really early on thinking through, is there something in it for all of them, is vitally important before you proceed, because if you cannot align those values and those benefits for all the different stakeholder groups, then it's highly unlikely that it will succeed. And that in some cases might mean that if you do not do that work early on, there's a lot of resources and investment in time and money going into an ultimately unsuccessful research and development.
Thank you. So Fabienne and, oh, sorry.
If you don't mind, I just want to give you a little clinical vignette, which I think captures something of Dean and what you were saying. So one of our patients is on the verapamil study, and he's 6 months into the study. I don't actually know what he's on, but let's assume he's on verapamil for the moment. He goes to see his local endocrinologist, which is actually the first time he's been there since diagnosis. And she says to him, "You're going to get dementia." And he says, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, look at this. He says, just looking at his HbA1c, which actually was, I think it was something like about 5.2%. She said, "You must be having hypoglycemia all over the stage. You better stop this." And she didn't look to see that he had 92% time in range. The reason I'm telling you this story is that she'd never come across this kind of thing, where you had endogenous beta cell function sufficient that he was only on MDI, he wasn't on a pump or on CGM, that you can do this. And the idea is being able to, well, can I have that, please? And people don't ask, can I have that, please? So you've got to have a picture of what it could be, and then just like Wegovy, everyone's going to ask for it. I want some of that, please. So I think sometimes that kind of level of education, but also putting it in a way that you can align people by saying, "Oh yeah, I'll have some of that," is quite powerful.
We use a term, start with the end in mind. So if you can really imagine and illustrate and describe how a patient would live using that new therapy, that is such a crystal clear picture that you can then use when you communicate to your different stakeholders, because they all speak different languages, but you have to align them to one vision. And so I think it is really important to have that strong end in mind early on.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, Fabienne and Simon, I wanted to ask from a discovery research perspective, do you think it's a done deal? Do you think we have enough targets? And the second question I wanted to ask you was about, obviously C-peptide is being shown perhaps to be not necessarily the best endpoint for clinical trials. What else do we have? Do we know the disease progress well enough to understand what actually is telling us whether disease is effective and safe?
Okay, well, thank you, Josephine. I'll start with the research. Have we done enough? The answer is clearly not. In preparation for today, I actually reopened the type 1 diabetes crime file, so to speak. I went back to the crime scene, and it felt like a cold case. It's like, because the preclinical models are not perfect, they've been disappointing in many ways. They haven't translated into a drug or a treatment in the clinic. That early discovery has been put aside, more or less, at least in Australia, I feel it's very much the case. And people have focused very much on taking care of the victim, which is a good idea. The patients need solution. But the solution we're giving to the patients, they progress, but they're mostly managing, they're not curing. So I think if I look at the research very carefully, we have progressed enormously with the technology. We can do single cell sequencing, we can do spatial transcriptomics, we can do reverse genetics. I'll give you an example with lupus, for instance, where Carola Vinuesa has found a gain of function in a gene called TLR7. She made a mouse model of that developed lupus. I think, can we do that with type 1 diabetes? I don't know, but I think it's worth putting the effort. It's worth revisiting the crime scene. There's plenty of stuff I can see there. I would love to re-explore further if I was working on type 1 diabetes.
Simon?
Of course, I'm going to echo that. I'm going to take the perspective that's my science journey, is to focus on opportunities and say that the technologies that Fabienne refers to have really changed us from a little torch in a dark room now to the sun shining on the question. And the other opportunity that will bring discovery research to new targets and better biomarkers, because that's what's missing, is applying it to the right cohorts and asking questions like, if there are 50 things that changed in your favorite T cell, which ones of those changed just because something else made them change, and which ones drove something that you then want to modify? So I really think that the molecular revolution and the 3D genomics and all this genetic and epigenetic risk that is talked about, but still poorly understood, once some of that is unraveled better, we will have the drivers of disease and we will have progression. And I think those are the big opportunities. And the work won't be done until there are personalised therapies that are stratified to individual, even at the family level, because the epigenetic and genetic combination is probably unique down to that level. Cancer immunology is a bit further ahead in this space, and it's obviously a little easier to do some of those high-risk trials in cancer, but I agree that we need to try to work out how to do some of those really exploratory immunological trials in a personalised way more sooner.
Thank you. So Sanjoy, I've saved the hardest question perhaps for you. What I wanted to ask you was, how do you bring all of these voices together to achieve our endpoint? We know what our endpoint looks like, but how do we do this?
Getting these voices that is represented here is somewhat easier. Getting the ones not represented here is not so easy. Regulators and payers. So I'll answer your question in a different way here. Obviously, we try at JDRF globally to bring together diverse minds, to solve complex problems, because if one of them could solve it, we would have solved it by now. So we have had consortia approaches to bring them together. We started with artificial pancreas consortia, where we brought mathematicians, nuclear power plant scientists, Boeing scientists, endocrinologists, regular, researchers, and so many other people together to develop the algorithms. And I'm giving you that example not only because it's a success story scientifically, but it actually covers the entire pipeline. That was not enough. That was only half the battle won. We had to write the clinical trial guidance document that FDA eventually adopted. So then there was a regulatory pathway which opened the floodgates for innovation, and companies automatically came in because now they could see a pathway to product development. So now we are sitting in a place where we are dialing back our investment in artificial pancreas, because it's not just a surviving field, it's a thriving field, where there's healthy competition to bring better products to the people. We're hoping we can emulate that in some of the other areas here. So, and then we have the cell therapy consortia. We used to have a microbiome consortium, a viral consortia, so on and so forth. That's how one way we try to solve the problem, and we have regulators and payers coming into these consortia too. I'll just give an example of an opportunity and a barrier, because that's the title of the session here. The opportunity here is that in the area of what we term as cures at JDRF, which is screening, disease-modifying therapies, and cell therapy, 5 years ago, can I say pharma is invested in this area? No, absolutely not. But if you look at the last 18 months with the investments from Provention, Sanofi, Vertex, Beitat, most recently Eli Lilly and others, so there is a healthy upward trend. Are we where we need to be? No. We're not, but there is somewhat of an investment, so close to $7 billion has been invested in type 1 in the last 18 to 24 months. So this is just what's publicly disclosed. So that's an opportunity that we want to build on, because we are not going to develop the therapy, I'm sorry. Academics will not be developing the therapy. Pharma and device companies will develop the therapy. What is the barrier? And I acknowledge all the barriers stated by the experts here. Couldn't agree more, but I want to give a different flavor of a barrier. Are we truly global? I don't think we are. It's a huge hurdle for a pharma company to reinvent the wheel with each regulator, with each payer system. JDRF or any one organization can't solve it, but globally, what can we do? I think we need more health economic outcome research in T1D to know the value proposition of a teplizumab or a VX-880. Because we won't be able to do 5-year, 10-year trials, but we will have to be able to extrapolate that. And so that's an area where I think there's a huge gap here. And the last point I will mention is building a little bit on what Christine said, but in a different angle for clinical trials. I was taught quite early on in my career, don't bring the trial to a patient. Bring the patient to the trial. How many of us in this room, can I get a show of hands, bring the patient in at the very start of a trial design? I suspected that. We bring the trial, and then we figure out things like, can a patient take a 14-day infusion? Will they go under the knife for a cell transfusion, and so on and so forth? So these are some of the things that we are trying to address, and I'm hoping that the entire community will be able to address that. So.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a few more minutes for some questions from the floor. Huh?
First of all, as the adult endocrinologist, still sees patients. I just wanted to say, first of all, I thought you were a bit harsh on the adult endocrinologist. Helps here too.
Yeah.
I think we do pick up on new things. And when there's a new thing, I think that pump CGM was introduced relatively quickly in Australia. There's obviously the payer issues. Type 2 diabetes, when the EMPA-REG study was announced in Stockholm, it was picked up almost instantly, and the usage of the new drugs for type 2 diabetes has been very good. The new drugs for kidney disease, finerenone, whatever, they're very actively searched for. What I wonder is, the question is, can we learn something from juvenile arthritis? Because they give biologics to those kids, and I think parents accept it. Why wouldn't that be a good learning lesson for type 1 diabetes, which hasn't had that experience yet?
I was thinking about that very thing as the others were talking. The difference is pain, right? We all want to treat pain, and so do parents, and so do people who've got it. So there's no way we'd be giving children with chronic pain due to inflammatory disease opiates. You guys are giving insulin to treat pain in beta cells. So you've just got to turn it around. I mean, it's like pain, it's inflammation, it's red hot. You don't treat that with opiates.
Can I just respond very quickly to the, I hope you're right I think that's a very positive message, Mark, and there's just no doubt that we have to win the hearts and minds of adult endocrinologists, who are probably a harder ask than paediatric endocrinologists, but whether that's difficult to do or not, we need to find something that meets adult endocrinologists' needs in the way that's been discussed, and we need to go down that path of convincing them. I mean, one slight counterpoint is the slide Colin showed of the people who voted no at for teplizumab at the FDA, who are prominent adult endocrinologists. So I think it's a good idea, a good thought, and the ball's in our court really to go out there and do a bit of influencing.
So Tom, do you think that that's one of the roles that ADS can play as a professional health body representing endocrinologists and also FRACP?
Well, for sure. I mean, the how could I say no with Soft sitting here? But as long as he doesn't think all the funding is going to go to beta cell function, which I gather he does. So I think that it's multi-pronged, right? This idea of finding environments like national conferences where you can present your data and talk to other leaders in the field. That gathering. So a meeting like the ADC is a crucial forum for us getting our message out. And we've had great opportunities to do that. Helen's talking at ADC in Adelaide in a couple of weeks' time, and I talked last year and so on. So we have had those opportunities. So absolutely vital, but I think there are many other channels as well.
Thank you. So Phil?
Yeah, so I'm not an endocrinologist, I'm a nephrologist here, so I'm glad to see there's another card carrying on.
There's a few in the room today.
So I guess what I was saying, that the people in this room accepted that endocrinology is not about treating autoimmune disease. It's about waiting till the autoimmune disease has destroyed the organ and then giving people insulin. It's like me waiting till someone's kidneys failed and then starting dialysis. And now, I know admittedly there's challenges in there, but I think now we're moving into clinical trials. You can learn a lot from other people from what they do. So as Ranjeny said, and I agree because we do the same thing, no one gives treatment for 24 days for a life-threatening illness. If you've got renal lupus, you're lucky, you might get a small percentage off immunosuppression after a couple of years. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if I was waiting till the person got to stage 3, 4 kidney failure before I started any treatment, it was bound to be a failure. So the other thing is, I think, waiting till they present with hyperglycemia, you've already picked a group of patients who are bound to fail. Now, I know it's challenging, but I think that means, well, we need to select earlier, so how do we select those people? And therefore, that becomes a research question to which you need to find an answer if you really want to move the field so this becomes mainstream rather than encouraging therapies in a small subgroup of the patients, but not relevant to the wider audience.
Thank you. I'm going to give you the last word, Mike, so I'm just going to get Elif's question and then I'll head.
Thank you, Elif Akinci, the University of Melbourne. Just want to thank everyone here, but also just to acknowledge that adult endocrinologists are really keen. As soon as we've got the data, as soon as there's safety data, long-term safety data, adult endocrinologists want to be able to, manage their patients with these medications if it, really the data is there. And also, I think the other logistic issue is, trying to get people earlier on in the disease. So that's another hurdle that will need to be faced, but we're definitely keen. So,
thank you. And so the last word, because I think we're.
Right. So.
Oh, we've still got 10. Oh.
I'm not an endocrinologist or a nephrologist or even an immunologist, but I have heard on many occasions in different places that type 1 is not one type, that you don't yet understand the heterogeneity of the disease. How confounding is that challenge to the identification of breakthroughs in the immunology that may underlie instead of?
Can I just speak to that?
Yes, so just a moment. My apologies. We've actually got 10 more minutes, so please. I haven't got 10 minutes.
I'm not going to speak for 10. But in case you didn't hear, it's about the challenge of different subtypes of the disease. And we have this in all autoimmune diseases. It's not a new thing. And Simon's and Fabienne talked about personalisation. And okay, that's a great thing to aspire to, but actually the way that other diseases have solved this is with combination. Because before you get to personalisation and understanding, which disease for each drug, drug for each subtype, you just combine different mechanisms of action and then you cover the population of your disease. It's pragmatic. And then you try to get to the ideal with research, and hopefully we're going to get there, but that's some time away.
And,
So just, Mike, that's a topic we debate a lot, and Mark Atkinson, if he was here, he would talk about endotyping and personalized medicine. I agree with Ranjeny in that it's a trade-off. I mean, we do know a lot about type 1 diabetes. We do not know a lot about type 1 diabetes. But we are living in an era where we just got our first disease-modifying therapy approved in one country. And so when we get into personalized medicine, I know there are orphan indication and rare diseases that have a different pathway to regulatory approval and commercialization. But when we start slicing the pie towards the very fine pieces, then the commercial barrier in some cases can be insurmountable early on where there is no other option. But when we have the fortunate circumstance of having 4 or 5 disease-modifying therapies, like you have 5 closed-loop systems now, then you can think of personalized algorithms for pregnancy, especially the first 2 trimesters, where you have a lower threshold, and things like that. But I think right now, I'm not discouraging personalized medicine or understanding of the disease, but right now I think we will be shooting ourselves in the foot if we get into these very specific targeted therapy development. Because we are already dealing with a small population, and then it's the commercial barrier is just enhanced. But Lenny and others, feel free to disagree.
That's exactly who I was going to ask, Lenny and Katja. You probably have a
feel free to disagree.
Strong industry perspective there.
If I could just comment here, there might be an opportunity to look at have 2 goals and pursue both goals at the same time. And so the personalized medicine one might be one where we know that longitudinal surveillance data might actually give us insights that we need to pick up really early. And in that case, many other autoimmune diseases and other diseases need exactly the same. So there is an opportunity perhaps to think a bit bigger and multidisciplinary pursuing that goal, whilst looking at the more commercially viable type 1 diabetes targets in a second stream. So maybe there is a possibility to pursue both, just with a different strategy.
I'd like to come in on this and take a slightly provocative response to that, and it would be pharmaceutical companies don't have type 1 diabetes, taxpayers do. And I belong to a community of taxpayer-funded scientists, and I think I have a duty to try to do the really hard stuff that won't necessarily make large company X jump straight in. But the path to personalised is a better detailed understanding of all of the aspects of the immune system. And I think the comment made that the immune system's frightening and we don't understand it, and a lot of people don't even know a T cell from a B cell. We have to work on that. We've got to solve that so that people are not frightened by it, and then understand that if you harness that properly, you can get good results. CD3 is a fantastic step in that direction, but it potentially could turn off any T cell, including the ones that stop you getting COVID. And that's where the more focused immunology needs to be applied. So I think we have to do both without necessarily immediately the billion-dollar blockbuster as the prize.
I think more to the point, if you understand the type of diversity you have in your patients and you understand the subgroup you may have, you got a chance to treat them potentially better with what you've got. And I think it's an information worth knowing at the molecular level.
Lenny?
Yes. So patients are heterogeneous by definition. However, I totally agree with Sanjoy that we don't want to discourage the development right now. When we have 10, we can play with it. But my thinking right now, if I had unlimited resources and everything was available, why don't we do multiple combination therapy to cover any places that the immune system is going to escape, just like our other colleagues do. Or in the case of the teplizumab, now I'm going to wear my company hat because fundamentally this disease is T-cell driven. So if you have a T-cell mediated, T-cell targeted disease, it has to impact in some way. Now, is it going to be a 1-month effect, a 2-year effect, or a 3-year? I think there are going to be triggers why people break through, and we have to understand that. But I think we can do all of these together, understanding why this relapsing remitting type 1 diabetes, right? It's not at the beginning and then you're downhill. You're doing this with type 1 diabetes, like lupus does this. And so we just need to understand what triggers the immune system to reactivate. And whether we redose with the same drug or we do combination therapy, it could be all of those.
I just wanted that great discussion. Ranjeny's saying you use combinations, which is great, but of course you've got to be able not to add to risk. But there's also picking up people as they escape. So, that's what you also do in RA, right? That they don't respond to this drug, so let's go on to that drug. That's what we don't do at the moment. It's the advantage of treating people in stage 1 and 2. If we have the markers to say, this isn't working, let's switch to something else, that helps us deal with the heterogeneity as well.
And your smart design is really smart. I like that. I want to give you some hope. When the disease-modifying drugs were introduced for RA and the other rheumatic diseases, we had no idea how they worked, had no idea what the immune targets were, and it's only since the immunological, techniques have got better that we now understand. And we have the advantage in type 1 that we've got a huge understanding mechanistically of how these drugs are working. I mean, Helen, all of that work that was done before the Jacobs went into type 1, we had no idea of all of that before it went into RA and worked. And the same with teplizumab, with biomarkers. So you guys should feel hopeful that I think advances will be quick. And once these things get into post-marketing, people will do clinical translational studies and on the drug, off the drug, which they can get. They don't have to ask for the drug, people will be on it, and we'll discover more. So don't give up.
We've been talking about a perfect world where all things are possible, and I just wondered about money and resources and where would they be coming from. Obviously this is you showed for TZIL, 15, 20, when was the first study done? 1980s, 1990, preclinical?
88.
Right. So that gives you a perspective on the length of the pipeline and the length of innovation that needs to be supported all the way through everything that everyone has been saying here. Where does that come from? And what advice have you got for the people in the audience who might be diving in and need that expertise?
Who's that one for?
Who's going to?
Well, I guess I'll have a bit of a stab at it. I mean, one of the really One of the fortunate situations we're in studying type 1 diabetes is the existence of the JDRF, which is clearly an important funder. For example, in RA, in arthritis, there really isn't, I don't think, an equivalent kind of...
You're so lucky.
Funding agency. That's right. I think that's partly why...
Why do you think I'm here? For money?
It's
not altruism.
She saw her sister doing well in diabetes.
Exactly. Give me some
involved.
of that.
So, but I think also, of course, it's sort of wrong to exclusively sort of default and rely on JDRF. And of course, I see Glenn up the back, and DA is important at also particularly in formative parts of people's careers. So we've got these two funding bodies that are very helpful, and then there's a lot of doom and gloom about the competitive funding agencies from SOF and so on. There's anxiety about that. Of course, and a lot of publicity for the MRFF in the last couple of weeks is a big efforts to reform the MRFF, to improve it. But so we've got this. When you combine the MREA, the NHMRC's endowment, and you combine the MRFF, they're very significant. They're very significant pots of money. And I guess to me, there are all sorts of issues about how we deal with funding, and that we need to look a little bit away from just from the competitive grant scene, because of course we all know the success rates are low, and we don't want to be caught in this sort of funding, grant writing, not getting your grant, writing another grant, getting a publication out, this incredible academic cycle. So I think thinking big about what people are trying to achieve, what the end goal is, thinking about what kind of capital is required to get to that end goal, not thinking about can I get my next little grant, but can I think about more broadly about where does money exist in the community? How can you get your hands on money, whether that's from industry or from VCs or from angel investors or from, what are the structures that are available for capital? We as a community need to be more sophisticated about accessing capital rather than just thinking about writing our next grant. That's the way I would see it.
Can I add another comment outside? I think the other commodity that we really need to remember to invest in is the people to replace us and our junior and trainees, emerging stars, rising stars. I think the JDRF is a good example of an organisation which does invest in that, and that's really important. So that is another very important opportunity that we need to make sure we promote in our field.
I'll just add a quick corollary comment to Tom's. I really like Tom's wisdom in summarizing this. I'll come from a funder's angle, and please speak for myself, but also probably Dorota and Mike and others here. Yes, I think right now the investment in type 1 diabetes I'm not counting the private sector, but given Helmsley Charitable Trust, JDRF, the federal funding in various countries is not bad. Do we need more money? Of course we need more money.
Like that in Australia. We're not getting the percentage. The NHMRC, MRFF contribution to type 1 diabetes is not going well. In actual fact, probably JDRF partly works against it because people go, well, you can go to JDRF. So, whereas I work in both type 1 and type 2 complications, so we have a bit more access. We go to the Heart Foundation, to whatever. I think for the young people, type 1 diabetes is a very difficult field. And the young endocrinologists or the young physicians will go to neuroscience, oncology, and infectious disease and immunology. And JDRF used to be better at supporting that younger group.
I can talk about it a bit later. I think I take it up afterwards.
Yeah.
No, but it's just been brought up by Joseph.
Yeah. So you're the point.
I just want to say, I don't think it's right for. I'm not blaming Sanjoy, but he doesn't know the Australian context. It's different to Europe.
Yeah, Mark, I was making a different point. I'm saying collectively, globally. I'm not looking at Australia or Sweden or Kenya. What I'm saying is collectively, the amount of money that the funders, other than the private sector, which is also bringing in capital here, is not bad. I'm just following up on Tom's comment is that one of the things I think we all should collectively do, starting with me probably, is efficiencies in research. And we have thought about how can we be efficient in some of the research in trying to collaborate and leverage. We're doing a lot of that. The funding is collectively, not in Australia, but collectively is is better than before, especially with Helmsley coming in a very big way, and at least the US federal government and some other federal governments coming in quite a big way, and we'll advocate for more, and we'll try to increase our own budget as well. But I think we also have a responsibility to try and be as efficient as possible, because right now, it's a good thing, but we are funding 7 screening projects. And can we bring all the learnings together? I know we make attempts of doing that, but there are several ways where we can centralize a lot of the efforts here. 7 major screening projects around the world, and so on and so forth. And so there are things I think we have to work as a community together to also bring in efficiencies, because at the end of the day, there will always be a finite amount of money. Money will always be insufficient. But how can we work within that network is, I think, a responsibility we all have here.
And tomorrow morning we will be talking about the EMCRs and how best to support them. So please come along, and we'd love to hear from you about that. And it's my very great pleasure to thank this very illustrious panel for the excellent discussion, and I'm sure you got a lot out of this, and we got a lot more probably thought-provoking things, but I guess the main information that we got is that we need to work together.